up next, we have Sarah Frank from the University of Applied Sciences in Austria, and she's going to talk about analyzing user behavior in a self-regulated learning environment. So we're going to get to see some really interesting analysis. I'm looking forward to this as well. So Sarah, I'm going to, if you can unmute whenever your convenience.
Thank you.
And I'm going to turn it over to you to share your screen and take it away.
Well, welcome everyone. I'm Sarah, and I'll be presenting the findings from Alexander Nussbaumer, Christian Güttl, and my research into user behavior in a self-regulated learning environment today. As for the outline of the presentation, I will first give you a short introduction by going into our motivation and shortly describe the problem that we faced, or just what we wanted to find out by doing this analysis. Then I will give you an overview of the learning system whose students we analyzed. And following this, I will briefly talk about the methods we used and then continue on to the results. Finally, I'm going to go on to the conclusion and touch on to future work that awaits us, because we can always find new things to do. Now, what was the goal of our research? First off, we had data of all content accesses of the students, so we obviously wanted to find user behavior patterns. And then we also had assessment results for each assessment attempt for each student in addition to that. So we wanted to look into how those possible behavior patterns that we previously wanted to find impact performance and or assessment results. As for the why, well, the goal is to improve the support for the students and the learning process by understanding what they do, how they interact with the course content, with the course in general, when they learn, how often they learn, things like that. And then we also wanted to improve the learning system in general, because it's always understanding how users use a system is always just very necessary when you want to improve that system. It just helps. And in this case, that was also a goal. To explain it in fewer words and with an image, we wanted to know what differentiates these students with only one assessment attempt from these students with more than one assessment attempt. And why are we doing it this way and not going by results? Like in general, with a different course, you would probably go by the assessment outcomes or by the grades. Well, in this case, that wasn't really helpful because the students all repeated all assessments until they had 100% of the available points. So if we didn't look into who repeated an assessment or not as an indicator for how successful they were in their learning, then we wouldn't really have had anything to look into. Now, for the learning system that we analyzed, this is one that was created by Alexander Nussbaumer. And so far, it's only used for one course, and it's offered as part of a semester-long in-person university course. And it's partway through the semester, containing 3 topics, each with a number of content chapters and an assessment at the end of each of the 3 topics. As I already mentioned before, the assessments can be repeated as often as a student wants, and only the last assessment attempt is taken for the actual grade. Now, because the learning system is self-regulated, students can choose their own path through the material. They have to take the 3 assessments to pass, but beyond that, they're free to choose when or even if they want to look at each chapter of the course content or not. For this, the system provides an index from where the students can access each of the course content chapters, and then they can afterwards return to the index and from there choose where to go next. I have a selection of the possible pages that they can navigate to on the slide. However, there's also the possibility to go from the index to the next page, which would be Unit 1, page 1, and then to the next page, which would be Unit 1, page 2, and so on, which would be the suggested way through the course as the creator of the course intended it. But again, the students are free to choose whichever of the two ways they prefer. To gain insight into how they use the course, which one of the two ways the students preferred, and just in general, if they prefer the first way, using the index, which pages they jump to from the index, we used heat maps and sequence extraction and analysis. The second was previously done by Maleko et al., and we used the methods similarly as they did in their paper, though we simplified it a bit to make it useful for our much smaller data set. With those two methods, we could visualize how students move through the course content, like when they come from the index, where do they go next? Do they use the progress page? Do they not use it at all? Do they even look at the instructions, or do they just go off and try their best? What you see here is the heat maps that contains the answer, or some of the answers. And this all positive numbers are state transitions that were more commonly shown by students who did not repeat assessments, while the negative numbers, displayed in blue, were more often used by students who did repeat assessments. What we can see here is that there is a lot more blue than there is red, very light blues, so not a lot stronger shown by students who repeated than students who did not repeat, but still blue nonetheless. Now, this plays part of the path through the content that we would expect if students follow the suggested path, like going from the index to the instructions to the first content to the second content, as the creator of the course created the course. As we can see, it was a lot more commonly used by students who did not repeat an assessment than by those who did. On the other hand, this shows some of the more common transitions for students who did repeat assessments. Basically, it seemed to be more common for those students to use the index to navigate through the course content than it was for students who did not repeat. On the other hand, it seems like students who did not repeat just used the next button and looked at the next page in whatever order the creator of the course decided. Now, that might also all be very nice and colorful, but it's also useful to look at it statistically and the other way around. We saw that apparently students who repeat assessments often navigate more freely through the course content because there was a lot of blue in the heat maps. We called that behavior unstructured learning in this case, just because they were free in the consumption of the course content. What we can see in the table now is that for all of the assessment, unstructured learners were more likely to repeat an assessment than they were to not repeat. With structured learners, we see that they were much more likely not to repeat assessments than they were to repeat assessments, at least for assessment 1 and 2, and only barely more likely to repeat in assessment 3. Now, it would be interesting to know what is so different for assessment 3 that structured learners had such a higher probability of repeating this than in other cases, and also look at assessment 2 to see why this differed for unstructured learners. But we did not get to that. Now for the sequence extraction results, those showed few results until we lowered the support to 10%, which is quite low, as in, well, the paper we used as a reference for this part used the support 20%, and we started out with that. And we barely got any results, well, sequences that managed to get to those 20% support. Where I mean support is basically this sequence was 20% of the found sequences. And even when using the 10% support, we still only got view and review actions on their own, where view actions are just students looking at new course content or like course content that they haven't viewed before, and review actions being going back, looking at a previously viewed course content. Any other sequences were not represented enough. Taking assessments was just, there were too few assessments taken, so none of those actions were represented in the sequences that we extracted. What we can see, though, is that students who repeated had more review actions in a row than students who did not repeat, and students who did not repeat had more view actions in a row than students who did repeat. That just tells us that students who repeated assessments largely went back and reviewed, probably. Now, to briefly conclude and summarize what we did again, we analyzed behavior patterns in a self-regulated learning environment using heat maps and sequence extraction and analysis. And we found that there seems to be a higher likelihood for students who repeat an assessment, if they display unstructured learning behavior. And we also found that repeating students had more review actions in a row, but fewer view actions. Now, this is not to say that students repeating an assessment is inherently bad, because this is a self-regulated learning course. The students are free to use it as they want, and just repeating an assessment more than once is not necessarily bad if the learned content sticks with them for longer. But of course, we can't check that. We can't say for sure that the students who finished their assessments with 100% on the first try are also those who actually still know anything. Maybe they learn and they knew it for the first 5 minutes after they finished the course chapters, and then they did the assessment and they knew. But of course, we can't tell that. And so it may be that the unstructured way that students access the course content and retook the assessments more than their structured learner counterparts was actually more useful for them in the long run. But again, we can't actually know that. As for future work, as you've likely gathered, the setting of the course was very specific. In online learning, self-regulated learning, any courses where students can just interact with the learning content as they want, you will probably very rarely get a group of students where every single one of them wants to finish the course at 100% of the points. This is very rare. You will probably also very rarely get a large course of students who all finish the course with not a single dropout. However, because this course was very specific, again, it was part of a larger, longer in-person course. So the students were already motivated because it was partway through. They put the work into it already. It was also a mandatory course, so they knew they had to take it at some point. It was a very different setting than if this had just been a non-mandatory course and only the online learning part without anything to get them motivated already. They had a social, like my previous speaker mentioned, they had the social system in place where they had a group of friends maybe in the course that took it at the same time as them, and they knew them because they visited the in-person course. So that all may have played a part in the students being motivated to finish and finish well. So the first thing I would do for any future attempts to look into this data or data from this course would be to change the setting or change single points of the setting and see how this changes the outcome. So for example, would students still be motivated to repeat the course so often until they get 100% of the points? Not repeat the course, the exam, sorry. If it's at the beginning of the longer in-person lecture type course at the university, when they haven't yet put any effort into it, or would they just try to pass and not care about what grade they come out at? Would they still finish the course if it stood on its own? Also, if it was longer, most of the students finished the course in one sitting with 3 different topics. It was still doable, but if the class was longer, if it contained more chapters, if it was an entire course, a university course on its own, they would probably not be able to do the whole thing in one setting anymore. So how would this affect their behavior? Would this change anything? And finally, having more classes using the system and more users in general would allow for further analysis. A lot of machine learning algorithms use more data than we had available. It was basically impossible to use machine learning on this. But if there were more data points, it would be possible to get meaningful results from this. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions now.
All right, fantastic. Thanks so much. We do have a few minutes for questions. One thing I was curious about, I might have just missed at the beginning, what was this particular course about? I'm just curious about the content a little bit, what they were learning in this course that you tested.
Yeah, it was actually it was a computer science course about like actually social media and how like was basically what I was doing for this analysis, and they learned all of that stuff. So it was mostly computer science students as well. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, and then was the format of the course, so it was self-paced, I guess, entirely. Was it, were there activities that they did on their own, or was it more reading and taking the assessment, reading and watching? Just curious about the format of the course.
It was actually, they basically had a few pages to read for each of the topics. There were a few, I call them chapters, but they were basically just web pages that they would read and click through or not, depending on if they wanted to. And then they would have multiple choice question type thing, single choice, multiple choice, and they would just do that.
That makes sense. I would imagine at least that the, sort of the style of the course would also have an effect on whether, even whether they want to jump ahead, right? Like some people are always going to want to jump ahead to the end.
Yeah,
but,
we definitely had students. Yeah. We definitely had students who did not look at the course content at all and tried all of the assessments, and then we're like, oh no, this didn't work out. I got way too bad grades, and then went back and revised the course content. Looked at it for the first time.
Right, which as you mentioned isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? I mean, if you want to, jump into that, and that's what kind of motivates them to go look at it. But then,
exactly,
they may have different views if the course were designed in a more sort of activity-based way. They might have, they might have felt it was, more fun to jump in and not necessarily go right to the test. It just depends.
Yeah, it's also very understandable from a student's perspective. I completely understand wanting to know what will the teacher actually ask me, and read the course content with that in mind. Yeah, no, and there's something, and then, I mean, there may be a lesson in that as well, right? That sort of when you start with a clear understanding of what the goals are going to be, that helps people sort of frame their understanding as they go through it, whether, so that maybe that argues for something that's at the beginning of a course design that,
takes the place of jumping ahead to the assessment in that traditional sense, right? So something that connects you a little bit better. And again, you don't get to design all these, you get to evaluate them. So it's not, but in terms of the advice that you might want to give, maybe there's something in there, or maybe there's something you might want to be able to do to test. Because I'm just going to suggest future work. That's my job here.
Sure.
So, there might be something in comparing and contrasting different approaches to the same end goal, right? So here's something where it's reading and taking a test, and here's how people behave. Here's the same content in principle, the same goal, trying to understand the same things, be able to do the same things, but put them in a different type of experience and see, how behavior changes. And it might be interesting to see that.
Yeah. For this part, because it was a mandatory course, there was only so much we could make different for each of the students. They all had to have the same experience, but it would definitely be interesting to change the course maybe over more years and then see how they approach it and how that changes.
Yeah, no, and I definitely understand. You can't do everything. It's not time to just say, let's design a whole bunch of courses and do all the evaluations and whatever time and budget you have. But it's interesting because one of the things, whenever I read the evaluations of online learning, it always feels like that's something that we wish you could do more of, is sort of contrast the different approaches, because I think people in the public tend to sort of view online learning as one thing, right? And I think there's a perception, even more so after the pandemic, that online learning is one thing. I think mostly people now think it's just teaching on Zoom, but still, it's in trying to counter that, certainly in the US, the public perception of what online learning is. So some of this could sort of help better get at, okay, well, this is one approach and there's the pros and cons of this approach. Here's a different approach. Here are the pros and cons of this approach. Here's where it's going to work better. Here's why this does work better, though it's more expensive, and get that sort of in people's minds a little bit more. So down the line, I think in some of those ways. Okay. Any other questions from the audience? We have a couple more minutes if we want, from people who are here. A little bit time for additional Q&A, and and if not, I think we're at the end of the session, so I think you can probably go ahead and wrap up. We're going to resume with the panel discussion at 1:30 this afternoon, and more to come throughout the rest of the day on this last day of the conference. So then I can let you go. So it's great being here with you. Thanks for coming and presenting your findings, which are really interesting and sound like they're also the beginning of a series of other things to come. So it's really really interesting to see what you found.
Thank you.